Why don't I jump in and just talk about this whole concept of digital transformation utopia to start? What exactly do I mean by that? Well, when we talk about utopia, you think about all the different technologies that are out there. There's a lot of different technologies that are really cool, sort of groundbreaking, forward-thinking technologies that have the ability to totally transform a business and provide completely new competencies that a lot of organizations have never had in the past. So you've got things like AI and machine learning. You have big data, Internet of Things. People are thinking and talking a lot about customer experience, employee experience. How do we make for a better customer and employee experience? You have robotics, robotic process automation, e-commerce, mobility. A lot of different trends, buzzwords, technologies that can be used. And most organizations are at point A, which is where they are today, and they're looking to that vision of the future of what point B may be. And what they find, or what we find, is that a lot of times organizations have very unrealistic expectations of how big of a jump they're about to make, how much effort, time, resources, and money it's going to take to get there. And ultimately, that's where a lot of companies first make their first big mistake, is they don't fully understand the magnitude of change that they're about to go through, and they don't fully understand the sweat and tears that go into getting to that point B, whatever that may be. So I think a lot of this, too, is also looking at these different technologies, and it's certainly okay to be enamored by some of these cool technologies, but you also want to be pragmatic and realistic about it. Where can we realistically leverage technology to help our organization? Maybe not in 5 or 10 years, but just in the next 2 or 3 years. What are some technologies that make sense for us to adopt that are aligned with our overall strategy and maybe get us down the path of taking on some of the more advanced technologies in the future? And that's okay. You don't need to adopt all these technologies that I have listed here overnight, and maybe years before you really seriously consider some of these. But a lot of organizations get too caught up in the technical buzzwords and the technical aspects and forget about some of the other aspects, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about what some of those other aspects are here in just a few minutes. So this unattainable transformation utopia is one of the big challenges that organizations face. And I would say, by the way, this whole concept of transformation utopia is becoming more and more of a problem. It's an increasing problem over time because technology is becoming more advanced. It's changing faster. It's just unbelievable capabilities are being developed by some of these software companies, which is really cool stuff, right? That's good stuff. I'm not knocking the vendors for doing what they do because they're good at it and they're sort of pushing the frontiers of what technology can do. But the problem is organizations where they are today is very different than where technology is. And so that chasm between where we are today and where technology is, that's only growing. And I suspect that's only going to grow over time because it's just a fact of life that organizations and people generally change a lot slower than technology. So you can see that over time that chasm that divide will increase and magnify over time. So what we see in this whole concept of utopia, in this unrealistic utopia, is that there's a flawed perception that the transformation is going to be easy, it's going to be cheap, it's going to be fast because we're using commercial off-the-shelf software. The vendors are telling us that technology is the best thing since sliced bread, and that's just not true. And so you sort of that whole idea of being enamored by technology and combined with the fact that the vendors are aggressively selling the technology oftentimes leads to this unrealistic expectation that the transformation is going to be easy. There's also an expectation that the technology is a silver bullet. So they think that by putting in technology, it's going to solve their business problems. And technology certainly is a tool and an enabler to solve the business problems, but it's only one piece of the overall puzzle. You also have to improve your processes. You have to change your culture, change your people, your organizational design. Your leadership oftentimes has to change and create a clear, aligned vision for where they want to go as an organization. So there's a lot more to it that I would argue is actually more important than the technology piece. When you look at the people, the process, and the overall strategy pieces of transformation and change, those components are a lot more important than the technology itself. Organizations typically underestimate the magnitude of risk and change, oftentimes because they don't know. They don't go through these major transformations that often, or they think that going through a massive, let's just call it an ERP rollout or some sort of modern digital transformation, they'll think that that's just like back in 98 when they switched over to Windows 98. It's how hard can it be? We're just going to roll out a new desktop operating system. It's an IT thing. Let's not worry too much about it. Well, technology is a lot different today than it was back when Windows 98 was rolled out in that example. This technology is fundamentally transforming how businesses operate. And so with that disruption, if you will, in what could be a good way, you need to also mitigate that risk and make sure that you're managing the entire transformation accordingly. And that includes addressing the human component of transformation, which 25 years into my career, I haven't seen the needle move a whole lot in terms of organizational and leadership focus on or prioritization on the human component of transformation. The ones that are more successful certainly do. The clients we work with that are most successful are the ones that understand and recognize that the change is going to be difficult, even if they think on the surface that their employees are all on board and they're all excited for new technologies. They don't fall for that. They know that even though people are on board and excited, there are going to be underlying fundamental resistances to change because of the magnitude that organizations are changing in today's day and age. And then finally, but certainly not least, organizational misalignment is a big reason why companies fail to achieve this transformation utopia. They're not rowing in the same direction. They haven't clearly articulated their goals and objectives as an organization. And they certainly haven't articulated clearly how this transformation ties into and supports and enables their overall transformation as well. So these are some of the challenges and some of the roadblocks and barriers that organizations oftentimes face as it relates to transformation utopia. And by the way, before I jump into this next segment, I encourage you to ask any questions you have along the way. I didn't mention that before, but I typically don't like presenting for 50 minutes straight. So I'd love any sort of interruption via questions. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop those in the chat and I'll have Kyler jump in and ping me with any questions that look particularly interesting, either as we go and or at the end. I can't see the chat right now because of I'm sharing my entire screen, so I'm keeping the PowerPoint up here. But certainly let me know if you have any questions, and Kyler can ping me with those. So I've talked a little bit about that transformation utopia. What's sort of the problem statement, the context, the lay of the land of why organizations struggle with change and why that struggle with change and why that magnitude of change is becoming even more apparent and more common here today, and why that divide is growing even more today. But now I want to shift gears and talk about some of the common transformation challenges that we face in the 2020s and beyond, and how do we navigate those common challenges that tie back to those problem statements that I laid out just a moment ago. So when we look at transformation success versus failure, I mentioned before that the companies that don't reach the third stage of success share a common set of characteristics or traits, and the organizations that do reach the third stage of success share another set of common characteristics and strengths. And so I feel like, as having done this for so long, if you tell me what an organization is or isn't doing, and if I were a betting person, which I'm not, I absolutely cannot stand to bet. I don't go to Vegas or bet money, but if I did, I could feel pretty confident that I'm going to bet on, I can tell whether or not an organization is going to succeed or fail based on some of these common characteristics. So some of those characteristics include, on the failure side, some of the things we've talked about: overambition of scope, unrealistic and over optimistic time and cost expectations. And I'm going to stop and just talk about that first bullet on the failure side just for a moment, because that's such an important one that it is actually a root cause for a lot of the other things that you see listed down below. And the reason for that is when there's a common dynamic in a transformation where you've got a clearly defined problem statement that let's just say our technology is outdated. Vendors not supporting our product, or we're still running on a mainframe AS400 system and it's time for us to get with the times, whatever it is. There's some sort of problem that you're trying to fix with your transformation. And oftentimes, most organizations we work with are pretty well aligned around that. They all sort of understand and agree with and align with that problem statement. So there's a certain amount of optimism that comes with that. People are on board. They've got that burning platform that they want to change. They want to get rid of that old system and move to something new. So on the surface, it looks like our organization is totally aligned. We're all on board, and resistance to change probably isn't going to be a huge issue because everyone seems to be on board. So it creates this false expectation that, well, everyone's on board, so this isn't going to be difficult for us. They all want new technology, so let's put in some new technology, and they're gonna love it. And you combine that with the optimism and the excitement and the momentum that gets built when people actually start seeing what the new technologies could potentially do. And so it creates this general excitement, this momentum in the project, which is great. You want to harness that momentum. But What ends up happening on the dark side of that momentum and excitement and optimism is that people then start to think that this is going to be easier or a lot easier than it really is going to be. And so when it comes time for us to go through the implementation planning process, the procurement process of new technologies, the way we structure the project, where we invest our time and money, many organizations find that they have underestimated across the board how much time and effort and cost it's going to take. So that unrealistic expectation is a very real and common dynamic that actually leads to a lot of these failures, that these other failure points listed here in front of you. And part of the reason for that, by the way, is that we haven't adequately scoped enough time and effort on a lot of these activities because we were so optimistic. We were overly optimistic, and we have all these blind spots now about what this transformation is really going to look like. So we haven't thought through the business operations. We haven't. We're trusting our vendors too much. We're not managing those vendors. We're sort of deferring or outsourcing the project to them, and they end up acting in ways oftentimes that are not in your best interest. So that creates another set of problems. You don't have the delivery capabilities. You haven't thought through the transition of how are we going to change our processes? How are we going to change our people? We're going to automate 50% of Susie's time, but what are we going to do with that 50% of Susie's time? We need to make decisions like that. These are just a few small examples, but you magnify that across your entire organization. There's a mass number of things that need to be thought through about how we're going to transition and move beyond just deploying new technology. How are we going to make sure that we're actually using that technology and that it fits our business? Lack of contingency planning. What happens if we can't ship product at the time we go live? Should we stockpile inventory? Should we push out our ETA dates or our available promise dates? All that stuff. You need to think about Plan B. What happens if we do run into trouble, and how are we going to manage and mitigate that? And then some of the other things that you'll see here listed here are very much related to organizational change too. We haven't managed the people and cultural change pieces of it. Even though that's just one bullet in a list of many, that should be by itself should be several bullets because it's so important. And that's an underlying thread that a lot of organizations struggle with. Now, when we flip the coin here and look at what are the common patterns we see with organizations that succeed, we see that these are the organizations that get experienced practitioners into key leadership positions. So people that have either been through transformations in the past, they've successfully led some sort of transformation, even if it's not an ERP or CRM or HCM or digital transformation, but some sort of massive change. You get people like that in key roles, either at the executive and leadership level and or at the project transformation level as well. You have to have a sort of healthy skepticism around what you hear from the industry. So when you're buying new technologies, keep in mind you're dealing with sales reps. These are people that want to sell you the best of what they offer. They aren't necessarily incentivized to sell you the worst of what they have to offer, what the dark side of what they're offering is. And by the way, any technology you deploy, and when I say any, I literally mean any technology you deploy, is going to have a dark side. There's something that's not perfect about that technology, or there's some sort of risk that needs to be managed. And it's your job to figure out what those risks are. It's not your vendor's job. You have to assume they're not necessarily going to tell you the difficulties of deploying the technology or all the roadblocks and pitfalls that you might run into when deploying their technology. So that's your job to figure out. And that's where we oftentimes help our clients from a program management perspective, is just to make sure that they have a realistic expectation around some of these things. You want a balance between technology and the business, which is very important. You don't want this to become a technology-driven project. And if you do let it become a technology-driven project, it's going to be just that. It's going to be new technology that people underuse, maybe in many cases don't use at all, and it's not going to deliver the business value that you expect. In many cases, it's actually going to hinder your business and create operational disruptions that are very hard to overcome. We have seen many businesses over the years that have gone out of business as a direct result of their ERP implementation failure. And in fact, if you Google it, you can find the names of lots of organizations, especially in the mid-market, that just got completely overwhelmed by their transformation. They spent way too much time and money on it, so therefore their cost structure increased. And to add insult to injury, they go live and it disrupts their operations and brings them to their knees. So those are very extreme situations, but the more moderate failures and challenges are what's even more common and what most organizations should really be worried about. You want to make sure you're not overambitious and doing, in essence, avoiding a lot of the things you see in the red box. You want to make sure that you've clearly defined your future state operationally, organizationally, culture-wise, technologically. You want to make sure you understand how all those systems are going to tie together, how the data is going to migrate over, what your new processes are going to be, what the org design is going to be, what your future state culture is going to be. All that stuff, that future state needs to be clearly defined before you ever start deploying technology. And if you've got a system integrator that's rushing to get on site to start deploying technology before you've done those things, you should really call a timeout and say, let's figure out what we want to be when we grow up, and then we'll bring on the system integrator, because we're going to be able to manage that system integrator and manage the transformation a lot better and more effectively and more cost effectively if we're doing so in a way after the fact that after we've already defined some of these things that we need to define in the future state. And I won't cover all the rest of these here. I'll let you read through them, but those are some of the major points I wanted to cherry pick from the success side of the equation, is making sure that you are following more of the best practices and things that you see on the right side in the green box than those on the left, on the red side. The things in red are the things you really want to avoid and be aware of, and watch the tendency to want to gravitate back towards that red side of the box. Because when left to their own devices, humans, if we don't have a clear governance structure and a clear vision for what we're doing for this transformation, we're going to drift towards the red box on the left. That's just human nature. And that's that gravity I was talking about in that third stage rocket launch analogy. The red box is the gravity that's pulling you back to it. And so you have to be a strong leader. You have to be very deliberate, have a clear vision, make the difficult decisions that are driven by your business, not by the technology, not by the software vendors, not by your system integrators, but driven by the business. That's the stuff that you want to use to drive the overall transformation and give you sort of that North Star for how you guide your project.
Essentially, we do operate in an industry that is focused on implementation. And now I just want to talk to what we consider to be three critical phases in terms of that road to that ERP life cycle. Absolutely, the implementation is essential, but it really is just the enabling platform that we're putting in place at this stage. And too often, we have that premature declaration of victory at the point of go live, and the very effective project governance and oversight and structures and capabilities that we've put in place dissipates, and things start to unravel a little bit as per that low road, and we fall into that valley of despair. And of course, the depth and breadth of that valley of despair is going to vary depending on how far on that low road to failure we are. So it's absolutely essential that we keep the project on the high road. And even with the best will in the world, there is going to be some disruption to business go live. Even if we do manage to stay on the high road to success, and we avoid these common pitfalls, those 5 pitfalls that are defined on the low road to failure, even if we do avoid them, there's going to be some disruption. We are going, to some extent, we are going to the valley of despair, but hopefully it is short-lived and we are quickly able to come out of it. And I think from a governance and tracking perspective, we're able to quickly come out of it and track the extent and understand whether we are on an upward curve on the way to that third phase of optimization. So I think that's the first thing that we need to recognize. Your digital transformation or ERP program is going to follow one of these 2 roads to some extent. And very important that we understand on which route, on which road we are at any point in time, and very important to understand when we are moving from stabilization to optimization, because one cannot jump from implementation to optimization without stabilizing the solution first. We cannot achieve benefit of an unstable platform. So it's fundamentally important that we're able to track this journey and understand which road we're on. So I did want to just explain that the ERP lifecycle before we can actually understand what the executive's role is in ensuring that we stay on the high road and avoid the low road, and that and most importantly that we avoid, or we spend as little time as possible in that valley of despair. Great. So first point, we have to take a view of a digital transformation or ERP project from business case to business benefit. Too often these projects default to a technology project, which is all about the implementation. And that's not particularly helpful. It's the platform that we're putting in place. So let's then start to unpack these 5 points of failure. And I do, at the risk of being slightly provocative, I do hold the executive to account for ensuring that we don't get caught up in these pitfalls. Let's start with the first one: misaligned expectations. Too often that's the case. Too often we start off on this journey and we do not have a common understanding and common alignment amongst all key stakeholders we're trying to achieve. Interpretations and expectation between and the key business owners who will be responsible for leveraging and utilizing the system. We often have a technology approach from the IT function, and an expectation of very often immediate benefits post-go live, not even having to go through this period of stabilization and improved user adoption support before we get some indication that those benefits are starting to occur. So if one looks at the different stakeholder groups, even beyond the executive, I think one first needs to ensure that the executive understand why we're doing this. And in my view, there's no good reason to do an ERP or digital transformation project without improving business performance, without contributing to improve business performance, whether that's bringing about new business capabilities or operational excellence or cost efficiencies, regulatory compliance, real-time visibility of information, whatever the case may be. We do need to ensure that as a unit, that executive understands where we're going with this, and how we will measure success. So what constitutes success? What are the key criteria? And my colleague Dom spoke a little bit about that in the previous session. But what are those key metrics that will inform success? And probably equally important, what are the key metrics that will inform failure? How do we know when we're on that low road? How do we know that when we're starting to take a dip on that low road? How will we track those metrics? But when you have differing expectations, that kind of permeates throughout the organization, because it's often the corridor talk that informs what the rest of the organization believes about this project, and the consistency of the message that's being communicated as to what is that pot of gold, what are we trying to achieve over here. And of course, then you throw the SI into the mix, the systems integrator, the solution provider, perhaps some other third-party integration or vendors or other institutions ecosystem partners you may do business with, and you have a very diverse group of stakeholders who want something different out of this project. Of course, there's a high dependency on the SI depending on how one structures the delivery model. And if that contract is set up all around go live, all around implementation, with little or no accountability for driving out improved business performance, then you already have a very different expectation and agenda from a critical party in terms of the broader stakeholder group. So the executive really has to be the glue that holds those expectations together, that ensures that there's a well-defined and consistent message throughout as to what it is we're after. And of course, that doesn't just that's not just relevant at the start of the ERP life cycle. When we, as an example, get into the design phase, or understanding what the current pain points are and how we will address that in the to-be design, or what new capabilities will be launched in order to drive improved revenue, we need to continue to reinforce those messages, because with the best will in the world, the project is going to default back to a technology project, because that is frankly just the industry that we operate in, and that is our SI contracts or scope. They do not define the expected business benefits. They define the technologies to be deployed, and everything and all reports and the narrative on the project is from a technology perspective rather than from an improved business benefit perspective. So let me just perhaps pause there after point one, Carla, and perhaps if there are, I can't see the questions at this point, but perhaps there are a few questions that we need to respond to.
Yes. So just a reminder, you can pop your questions in any chat that you are actually joining in via the comments. So we have a great question here from one of our LinkedIn viewers. That's how much time and effort do you invest in getting buy-in from senior management and engagement in an organization? And when do you maybe realize that that's not going to happen? So maybe not an executive piece, but understanding how you get that executive alignment and buy-in.
Yes, I think it's a great question, especially the second part of the question as to at what point does one start to understand that that's not going to happen. And then, of course, what does one do, depending on which role you're in terms of the broader program structure. But let me go to the first question first. I think if there needs to be some type of organizational readiness. Now whether you independent party doing such an assessment, call it a health check if you want, as to whether the organization as a whole is ready to proceed on this journey, or that's, whether that's done by the executive themselves internally, or the chair of the steering committee, or the CEO, whatever the case may be. I do think it needs to be a formal assessment. It perhaps doesn't have to be a real deep dive and take too much time and effort, but at least the question has to be asked. One has to test that with the relevant executive stakeholders as to whether we are aligned as to what we're wanting to achieve. And certainly from my perspective, Carla, I think what we call an executive boot camp, I cannot think of any ERP project focusing on any aspect of it where we do not start with an executive boot camp. It is so important, irrespective of what the role one is doing as third stage honor and engagement of this nature. It is absolutely fundamentally important that we just check where are things at, because if there are very divergent views, or there are people who want this and people who don't want this sitting on the executive, with organizational dynamics, this does disrupt that balance of the dynamic within the organization, commonly called company politics. But absolutely, it does change that dynamic, and it impacts different executives in different ways, some favorably, some less favorably. Sometimes it's a threat, sometimes it's a great platform to move forward on. So I think having some type of formal assessment up front, very important. Doesn't have to be a long, in-depth process, but at least some type of facilitated workshop where we test the strength of the alignment and understanding. And then I think secondly, what does one do when you realize it's not there? Well, in my view, if we cannot get to that point, one has to consider, do we pause the project? Mm-hmm. Do we pause the project and unpack what are the underlying issues that are inhibiting the desired level of alignment? Because the end result is that one is going to go live and you're going to have differing views, and there's nothing worse than being at it for 2 or 3 years, spending tens, and then getting to a point at the end where the executive have differing views on whether success has been achieved or not, and are interpreting it differently. There's nothing worse than that. So I think one has to consider, do we pause the project at this time and get the relevant stakeholders in a room and try and thrash this out?
Just that overall awareness around the reality of that conversation, and building on that, Clifford, Mark on LinkedIn had a comment and a question. So he said, executives have so many demands on their time and attention, but so often ERP failures are due to lack of executive engagement. Is it feasible for them to delegate accountability if they don't realistically feel able or qualified to lead an ERP project?
So my response to, because one hears this often, one hears it from end users when they need to test, business process owners when they need to be involved in design and sign it off, from executives when they need to sit in on steering committees and provide the necessary guidance and oversight. One hears often that, we're busy, we don't have time for a project. And my response is, surely in this day and age of rapid disruption and digital transformation, one of the primary, if not the primary role of the executive is to drive change, is to lead change. And one could even say to be a disrupting force within the executive layer of the organization. Surely it's not to maintain the status quo and do tomorrow as we've done yesterday. I mean, that's a path to failure, surely. It's a path to losing market share. One has to be able to continuously innovate and drive change. And that's what digital transformation is. It's we get caught up on the word digital, but it's about transformation. And as depicted on that high road and low road, that transformation is disruptive, and it needs the executive guidance, but it hopefully takes you to a better place where you are able to continue staying relevant in the market, able to launch new products and services, deploy them in new ways, connect with new customers, in different ways, etc., etc. So, to cut a long story short, I think it's a primary responsibility of an executive to guide and drive such change rather than to adopt a view that this is in addition to my day job.
What's a reasonable negotiation? What can you ask for? What is unreasonable to ask for? What are they never going to give to you? Because again, the process is really a collaborative process where you come out with an agreement that really sets forth exactly what's going to happen, so that when something goes off the rails, you can sit back in your chair at your desk, pull out your contract, and say, no SAP, no Oracle. Here's exactly what you agreed to do. And this is exactly the process by which you're going to remedy that situation. That is ultimately the goal. Okay. So, how do you get there and what are you up against? Well, you're up against a variety of different issues. Let me get to the right slide here. I think without a doubt, your ERP implementation is going to take longer than expected. I think, most of them do. It's going to cost more than you think it does. It is going to. It's going to exceed your budget. And unfortunately, I think most customers, most clients of mine don't realize all the business benefits that they thought they were going to realize when they were sold the software, certainly, and during that implementation process. And I think you just have to understand also, the scope and scale of the operational disruption that is going to take place. In the goal here today is, how do you use the contract document, the contract negotiation process, to give yourself what I would call a dog in the fight, to minimize, all of these issues from taking place. I don't think you can preclude them from taking place, but I think you can minimize the impact that they're going to have on your business, and utilize that contract in a way so that when these things do happen, you've got a remedy, a resolution, a path forward to mitigate the impact of some of these unexpected issues coming up. Now, I want to talk kind of as a springboard about a client of mine, LK Plastics. And I can't get into too many specifics of this particular case because it's all confidential. There was a settlement agreement reached with Oracle late last year. So I can't talk about the specifics, but I want to use it to talk about some of the generalities. I'll talk about some of the specifics. I'm not going to go into excessive detail, like I said, but what I will share with you is publicly available. You can go onto the court's website and pull the complaint and take a look at it. If anybody wants to have access to that document, they don't have access to Pacer and the like, I can certainly send that to you via email if you're really interested. So this situation, LK went on a search for a new software provider. I can't remember the provider they were, their legacy ERP system. I think actually it was Texas, which is maybe a second tier or third tier software provider. They were unhappy with the direction it was going. It was going to be sunsetted. So they went on a search for Oracle, or a new replacement rather. They settled on NetSuite, which is owned by Oracle. And they were very much sold, all the sizzle associated with, the software, all the functionality that it can do, all the amazing things that this cloud product was capable of. They embark on an implementation project that has a number of issues that come up, pretty much similar to the issues that we just talked about. But lo and behold, they get to a point where they're starting to test the system, and the system can't process any transaction within the software for the customer, for the client, at a rate faster than something like 15 seconds. It was shocking. So while 15 seconds for a processing time may not seem significant, I mean, if you think about it, if you hit send on an email, right, and it takes 15 seconds to send, or you hit save on a Word document, these are the applications I use on a regular basis, right, as a lawyer, it takes 15 seconds to send. That's going to be problematic. And in a scenario where you're processing hundreds of thousands potentially of orders, or even hundreds of orders every day, and you multiply that by 15 seconds, I mean, that can have a very significant impact on your business, right? I mean, it could potentially take you down. So you've got to remedy that situation. So here, in this situation, certainly, the client goes to Oracle and says, hey, well, you've got to fix this. And Oracle says, okay, well, we'll try to get that processing time down. They go through some iterations. It gets to a point where, they do bring down the processing time, but it's never something that, in our client's view was suitable for modern commercial needs, right? So, what does that mean? I mean, I think, here, I think when you go into these implementation scenarios, and the reason why they can fail is you can have there's going to be a resistance to change. And I was listening to the last presenters, and they talked about change management. And I think that kind of carries over to this as well, but it's a little bit different, right? I mean, this is a fundamental aspect of the software that is not working the way it was represented to work, or it doesn't work in a way that actually supports your business in a way that allows you to continue to conduct business in an efficient manner. That's a problem. That's not you being unwilling to change, I would argue, right? But I think certainly your ERP project can fail to the extent that you're not willing to adopt the way that software, the business flows in that software, right? There's going to have to be some kind of modification or change in the way that you do business to adapt to that software product. Now, I will sometimes have clients, and in this case, this is not that scenario, where they're so unwilling to change. What they want is to make massive modifications and customizations to the underlying software so that it essentially functions the same way as their legacy system, which to me doesn't make any sense. Okay. First of all, that is going to cause massive disruption in the implementation. You're not going to get the business benefits associated with the modern technology that you're supposedly implementing for those benefits. You're trying to replicate, in most cases, a 10-year-old system. That is a recipe for disaster. And, I think from a contracting perspective, you've got to have an understanding of what the scope is, what your business objectives are. And we'll talk about all these things in more detail in a little bit, but you've got to have a really clear laser focus on, what you are getting out of the software, what you want it to address, and really why you're implementing ERP software in the first place. Choosing the right integrator, certainly it's important, but it's not. It may not make or break the situation. I think in this particular case where you have, a piece of functionality that just doesn't work in the way that it was either represented or the way that you expected it to work, is a different vendor, a different integrator, implementer, consultant, are they going to be able to modify that in a way that addresses your particular scenario? Probably not. I think choosing the wrong integrator is going to have a substantive impact on your project in a real negative way. But choosing the right integrator is going to kind of keep you at status quo, I would say. I'm sure somebody's talked about this because it's talked about in seminars like this all the time, but executive misalignment can certainly kill your project, right? So, I think in LK's situation, they caught it early. There was executive involvement from, during that implementation. I won't say from the beginning necessarily. I think maybe there could have been more executive alignment, executive buy-in, and executive understanding from the very start of that project. But certainly they were involved enough to realize what was going on and make the informed decision as to whether they're going to continue down that path of modification and customization to get that software to a place where they wanted it to be, or they were simply going to walk away. Does the software work? I think in most of these situations, the software works. Okay, you're implementing Oracle, you're implementing SAP. These are products that have been put on the ground in virtually every continent, hundreds of, if not thousands of times over and over, for a variety of different types of customers. So, does the software work? I think the answer to that question certainly is yes. Now, it may not work for you, and it may not work in the way that it was represented to work for you. It may not address all of your business requirements. And that, that's a different scenario, right? But in my experience, having negotiated thousands of these types of contracts and litigating, dozens, more than dozens, of substantive ERP failures in courts across the country and before arbitration panels all over the country. If it's going to fail, it usually isn't a technology issue. Okay. And I think that's good news from a contracting perspective, because you can't contract around a piece of failed technology, but what you can contract around and what causes these implementation failures more often than not, it's a people issue, right? It's a process issue. So if you can utilize your contract to mitigate the likelihood that people are disconnecting, are not living up to the obligations that they have told you they're going to live up to, you're going to put yourself in a good position to avoid certainly an implementation failure. And again, I want to go through kind of what a typical implementation dispute looks like, because I think with that context behind you, then we can start talking about the contract in a little bit more detail. Okay, so all of these failures are different, right? There's a different piece of functionality that doesn't work. There's a different type of representation. There was an aggressive salesperson. Whatever it is, there's going to be something factually different associated with your implementation failure or your implementation than there is somebody else's. But in general, all of the ERP implementation disputes, lawsuits, problems have kind of a similar trajectory, and they usually have a handful of similar allegations that are made by the customer. Okay, and the first one is, look, the people you gave to us lacked experience. They didn't have the skill set to implement the software. They didn't understand our industry. They were never on site. They were remote. They were in Pakistan or the Philippines or whatever it is. What we were promised as a customer was the A team, right? But what you actually gave us was not even the B team, it was the D team. You used our implementation as a training ground to get your inexperienced consultants up and running. So to get them to the point where they could be utilized on other more important projects, perhaps. Now, and we see this a lot. The challenge with these disputes is when you point the finger right at the vendor, there's 3 or 4 fingers pointing right back at you, right? So the typical vendor response to this is something like, well, the customer's project manager and decision makers, they weren't available when we needed them. Okay, there was high employee turnover during the project, so it's not that we didn't have a lack of experience, it's that you didn't have a consistent workforce dedicated to the project. You didn't have an understanding, or your team didn't have an understanding of how the business was actually run. And moreover, your team didn't have the power to make decisions when we needed them to make decisions. They weren't fully invested in the conversion, right? That's kind of the way it's going to go, right? We will put something like this in a complaint asserting that, hey, you guys didn't have the experience. The response back will be something like that. One of the big ones is, look, your salespeople misrepresented the software's ability, its functionality. They misrepresented how the software was going to address our needs. Okay, this is almost always a part of any ERP implementation dispute, and it's a hard argument to make, but it's something that you've got to make from a strategic standpoint, because and this goes back to the contract. The contract that you're going to get from a vendor is typically a form contract that they will dissuade you from trying to negotiate in any substantive way. That will say everybody signs it. It's not our business model is not to negotiate this particular issue. So the contract is worse off than you think it is if you're going to try to make these allegations later down the road. God forbid your implementation fails and you've got to hire an attorney. And so the key here is you've got to get outside the 4 corners of that contract, and making an allegation of fraud or negligent misrepresentation is one of the best ways to do it, because all of those provisions in the contract that are not favorable to you, they all fall to the wayside. Okay. So this narrow limitation of liability, the narrow remedies that you're afforded, they all go away. And just by simply putting this type of an allegation in a complaint, in a demand for arbitration, whatever it is, in a letter, a demand letter, it's going to make their heads snap back, and they're going to understand that you know what you're doing, you're serious. But it's challenging. It's challenging for a variety of reasons to win on something like this or to make this argument successfully. And primarily, they've got a lot of good answers for this. Okay, they're going to say, look, the software met the agreed upon acceptance type criteria. The software performed as warranted in the contract because it substantially complied with the documentation. And we'll talk about warranties a little bit later. And that's an interesting one when they say it complied with the documentation. I'll bet you, dollars to donuts, so to speak, that you will have never seen that documentation, right? Or that the documentation doesn't talk about, the particular disconnect you're experiencing with the software. In addition to saying that it complies with the documentation, they will say that, the software and the functionality were demonstrated to you. You had the ability to look at it. And then they'll say, that, the software sales process was open, it was transparent, and your expectations are just unreasonable. Another typical allegation when these things go sideways is, look, we flipped the switch and we can't use the software. There's excessive processing times. We can't ship products. We have to have massive overtime for employees so that they can actually process transactions within the system. We can't comply with state or federal regulations. We're losing customers, whatever it is. I mean, it's a parade of horribles, right? I mean, we represented a few years ago with a very large tier 1 software implementation, a pet supplier, a supplier of pet products. Okay, a very large one that you're all probably familiar with. They flipped the switch, and all of a sudden they couldn't process their credit cards. They couldn't contact their customers. They had to get a call center to deal with all of the complaints. And ultimately what ended up happening is, because there were overcharges on credit cards, people actually called the police, and the police actually showed up at their corporate headquarters asking them what was going on. So, I mean, this stuff is substantive and it's real. And again, I think the standard vendor response is the software works, right? You as a customer just failed to re-engineer your business processes, or you didn't implement organizational change so that you could actually use the system. You wanted this system to function the same way that your legacy system functioned. That's the typical kind of back and forth that you would get with this one. So how do you avoid these things? Okay. And then, more importantly, let's talk about how you kind of can put these issues or address these issues within the contract itself, right? You've got to define clear project goals, right? What do you want out of the ERP system that you're implementing? Why do you want to implement the ERP system? You've got to identify and you've got to quantify opportunities for improvement in your current business state. I think what we will see sometimes is companies that just want to implement the latest and greatest technology. They've been on their legacy system for 10 years. They don't have an understanding of why they want to implement the software. It's just a technology thing. And if you're implementing an ERP system to get the latest and greatest technology, you're really going to do yourself a disservice, and you're setting yourself back. And I think you increase the likelihood of failure because you don't have a clearly defined goal. You're just chasing something. You have nothing that's measurable. You've got to define your business requirements, certainly, right? And ideally, those business requirements, to the extent you can, are going to be incorporated into the contract. I think it's critical that before you even evaluate, and certainly before you select a software system, you have to have an understanding of what your business requirements are. You need to focus on your current business processes, and clearly you've got to identify how those things can be improved. You've got to involve key employees, right, in the selection process. the implementation process. And I think one of the most important things is you've got to prioritize your deal breakers, and you can't make assumptions. In this LK scenario, they assumed that any modern software was going to be fit for modern commercial needs, and part and parcel to that would be that it would be fast, right? I mean, modern software is fast. That should be a given, right? But it's not, and you can't just make that type of assumption that the software is going to be fast enough for your business. You've got to understand, okay, the business today, we process transactions in 2 seconds, and any kind of replacement ERP software system needs to do that too, because if it doesn't, we're going to have an issue, which is what happened in the lawsuit that we talked about earlier. But I can't really fault them. I mean, I think that's such a bare basic requirement that you would assume that the software would perform transactions in a reasonably fast manner. It's almost like, you go buy a car, you don't have to make an assumption that it's going to come with wheels, right? You don't assume, or you make an assumption that it's going to come with wheels. You assume that it's going to have an engine, right? But in this context, I think you have to be very careful, and you have to make sure that you have, prioritized your deal breakers and you have written them down. And ideally, they should be incorporated into the contract. Anything that is important to you needs to be incorporated into the contract as a representation or a warranty. It needs to be included as an exhibit to the contract that the software is going to do X. Because without that, you're putting yourself at a massive disadvantage, and your attorney as well. I mean, if we have to litigate on the basis that something was important, and the other side, which is what happened in this Oracle case, it can just repeatedly say, well, you didn't write it down. You had an opportunity multiple times before you bought the software, and then during the implementation process to tell us that was a critical requirement, but you never did. That's a hard argument to win, right? The response to that is, well, we just assumed that it was going to be fast enough for our business. So, that's a significant issue that needs to be addressed. Prioritize your deal breakers and put them in the contract.
Some of the keys then to digital transformation success, then, we've talked about where some of the challenges are, but now if we sort of back up a little bit and say, well, how do we avoid these problems? I mean, I don't think anyone on this call or in this event will want their transformation to look like what, I've just described here with the challenges and some of the operational disruptions. So what do we do? How can we, can we avoid those problems is a big question. And the answer is a resounding yes, they can be avoided, and they are fairly predictable. The things that organizations do to create a lot of the problems that I just described are pretty predictable. On the flip side of the equation, the things that make projects successful are fairly predictable. It's not a surprise. In other words, it's usually when you see a failed project or a successful project, it's usually, if you look at what they did and what the organization's focused on and how they prioritized and the leadership behind it, the decisions behind it, how they manage their system integrator, all that stuff, it's a pretty common pattern in both buckets, the failures and the successes. Each one has different patterns, but they're very consistent within that bucket. So one of the first things to remember is that the failure can be avoided. So it's not just that these failures happen. It's not just bad luck. A lot of times the organizations themselves feel as though they're sort of deer in the headlights. They don't know what just happened to them. They don't know what's happening to them as it's happening. But it's not luck. There's something behind it that's very consistent and predictable in why those projects are failing. And so there are technology agnostic best practices that help avoid these sorts of failures. One of the biggest things that I constantly repeat, if you watch my videos, read my blogs or podcasts or anything like that, I constantly repeat that, bias in the industry is one of the biggest problems with transformations. And the bias comes from vendors. It comes from consultants that are focused on one technology. It comes from the blind spots in the industry. It comes from the monetary and economic incentives to sell more software. There's a ton of bias in this industry, which is why I started Third Stage, because I didn't like that there was so much bias, and I was part of that bias when I started my career. So I wanted to create a company that was sort of the opposite of that was unbiased, that didn't represent vendor best interest, but represented client best interest. And the reason that's so important is you do need to focus more on yourself and your business, your strategy and goals and objectives, and less on the software vendors and what they think you should do, because again, their job is to sell you software, and to be agnostic and independent is one of the best ways you can mitigate some of those risks. And then the last thing on the slide I'll mention is a final point, is that you don't want to settle for mediocre results. I mean, a lot of organizations are just glad to be in business after they get through a transformation. They're just glad they didn't have a complete unmitigated disaster. That's a pretty low bar to set, and you should really be aiming to not just not fail, but why are you going through this project in the first place? You're not doing it to not fail. You should be doing it to transform your business, improve your business, make it more ready for the 2020s and the 2030s. Make your employees more happy to be there, provide better service to your customers, all that stuff. So that should be where your mind should be, not on let's not screw this up. Because if your focus is on not screwing it up, you're probably going to fall a bit short of that goal. Whatever goal you set, you'll probably fall a bit short because these projects are hard. So you don't want to set the bar that low. And if you're focused on not failing, it creates this defensive mindset and this defensive decision-making process that usually, ironically, leads to more likelihood of failure. So for example, if I'm so focused on not failing or not blowing my budget, I'm probably going to make some bad short-sighted decisions like let's cut change management because that's going to save us a bunch of money. That would be an example of how I might make a decision if I'm just trying not to fail. Although the irony of that is if you really don't want to fail, you should probably invest more in change management. So that sort of decision-making is very difficult for organizations. But the key here is that the failure can certainly be avoided. So the next takeaway here in terms of what some of these best practices are for a successful transformation is to start with a clear digital strategy. Make sure you have a clear vision and that you've articulated and translated the vision into what the transformation means and what the project governance behind that transformation is, so that you have that clear vision of where you're headed and what you want to be when you grow up. One of the biggest challenges we see with organizations is it's almost like if you think of a not a bell curve, but think of a graph that maps out the morale and excitement and the momentum you have on a project like this. Usually it's pretty moderate. Let's just say when you first start the initial exploration of new technologies, but as you get momentum in that project and the executive team and the board approves the budget to go evaluate potential systems and they create that internal alignment and focus on we're going to move forward with a new system replacement or digital transformation. What ends up happening is you create excitement and momentum and people get really excited, and then they start to see the technologies and the possibilities that could be within their organization. And they get really excited and momentum's high, morale's high, right as you're selecting new software and you're getting ready to start the implementation. Unfortunately, that momentum peaks right there, right at the point where you decide on new technology and you get approval to move forward, you mobilize a team, everyone's excited. The minute you start facing headwinds and start stepping in landmines, the morale starts to drop. The excitement and momentum drops from its peak. And the reason I bring up this dynamic is it's at that point, at that peak point, is where a lot of organizations make bad decisions because they're so blinded by the optimism and the excitement that they don't think about, hey, maybe we should slow things down a bit and make sure we have a clear strategy and plan. And we've mobilized our resources. We've defined our business processes, and we started to take a look at our data. We have a clear data migration strategy. We have an organizational assessment, an organizational change strategy to address the unique organizational challenges that we're going to face during this transformation. They don't take the time to do all that stuff because they want to jump in and start implementing stuff because they're so excited. And then the vendors and the system integrators add fuel to that situation by saying, yeah, close the deal today and I'll give you a special deal that is a once in a lifetime deal. And you therefore sign the contracts, and all of a sudden you've got a million people, not a million, but you've got an army of consultants and a bunch of software that you're paying for starting on day one. And then it creates this whole domino effect now, a ripple effect of rushing towards an unclear goal and strategy. So you really want to make sure you've got that long-term strategy, the alignment, and that any decision you make along the way should be aligned with those longer-term goals and objectives and the blueprint and the parameters that you've defined before you've ever started deploying technology. The other takeaway too, the other sort of best practice, as I call them here, is to let business drive the technology. Don't let the technology drive the business. Now, technology is certainly going to provide you tools and capabilities that you don't have today, for sure. So, of course, the technology is going to bring you things that you can't do today, or it's very difficult to do today. But at the end of the day, your business and your business needs should drive the technology. It should be all about your strategy, your goals, objectives, what you're trying to do operationally, strategically, what sort of customer experience you're trying to enable, what kind of employee experience you're trying to enable, what kind of business value and ROI you're trying to create as an organization. That should all drive the technology deployment. Unfortunately, most organizations flip that and they focus so much on the technology. And then the vendors, of course, are focused on the technology because that's what they do. And so you've got all these people focused on technology, but not the business. And so you really have to flip the script on that and focus more on the business. Let the dog wag the tail instead of the tail wagging the dog. And it's important to remember that it's not an IT project, even if your CIO is the executive sponsor, or even if your IT team is heavily involved, which they should be in the project. It's not them that's leading it. It shouldn't be them that's leading it. It should be a business-driven initiative that focuses on business operations, strategy, business value, and the people, et cetera. Also, same with business process improvements. I mentioned before that the whole concept of software best practices and pre-configurations is a myth. They don't exist in terms of effective use. They do exist, and it's a great selling point. It's a great marketing message for vendors, and you can occasionally use them to your benefit, but more often than not, it's a misleading myth that it just doesn't add material value to a project. So you want to make sure that you do have, business process improvements defined up front that then you're going to use technology to help enable. It's backwards it may seem counterintuitive to some, but it is backwards to assume that we're just going to deploy technology and the technology will give us the answer for what our process improvements are going to be. If you take that mindset, then what's going to happen is, again, the path of least resistance. The organization is going to deploy technology the way they've always used technology because that's what they know and that's what they want. That's why you need a clear vision, a clear roadmap, a clear blueprint for what you want in terms of process improvements in the operational model going forward. And then finally, your transformation should be closely aligned with measurable strategic goals. And sounds simple enough, but it's a common trap that organizations fall into, that they get so enamored by technology, but they can't necessarily articulate how that technology is going to drive measurable strategic goals and objectives. And if you can't connect the dots, then that's probably a good indicator that maybe you should think about not buying that technology or not deploying that technology. And so you want to make sure that you don't get too caught up, again, in all the buzzwords and hype around AI and predictive analytics and machine learning. That stuff's great, but it may or may not add value to your business. And so that's really the key, is to understand, where's this technology going to add value to our business? And if it doesn't, maybe we don't deploy that technology, or maybe we look at a third party bolt-on for that part of the business, or maybe we just focus on improving the processes and standardizing some ways we do things and leveraging the technology we already have. That's okay too. So it's a matter of really having a clear vision of how the business will drive the technology and not the other way around. And another root cause of a lot of failure points and a lot of mistakes that happen in a project is this concept of unrealistic expectations. So oftentimes when that peak momentum point happens, which I talked about earlier, that peak momentum happens, we have pretty unrealistic expectations at that point. As humans, when we're excited, momentum's high, we see a vision for the future, it doesn't seem that difficult. It feels like we're all ready, right? We're ready to move forward. We found our software. We're about to sign a contract. That the vendor's promising us the world. They've told us we can implement this project, say, in 18 months. Let's go forward. And so you end up with this mindset that everything's great, everything's perfect, and you get into the project and realize it's not. There's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of headwinds, there's a lot of risk, a lot of things that you don't know when the peak excitement is there. So you want to be sure that you have a dose of healthy skepticism to make sure you have realistic expectations, because you want to understand what the risks are. Even at that time of peak excitement in a project, you still need to be thinking about, well, where are the risks? Okay, because this is exciting, right? But there are risks out there on the battlefield that we're about to enter. Let's go find where those landmines or risks are, rather than assume they're not there because we can't see them. They're there. We just need to find them so we don't step on them. So, and we can do that, by the way, in a way that's not demoralizing. In fact, it should be more empowering and more exciting to know that, hey, I see what's out there and I know what I'm about to do. rather than this sort of a blind fog that we might be walking into. So making sure we've got those realistic expectations is critical. That misalignment oftentimes with the misalignment around expectations often leads to rash and bad decisions. Again, if we have unrealistic expectations, what ends up happening is, because we think this implementation is going to take 18 months, which let's just say for hypothetical purposes, it was never going to be 18 months. It's more like 36 months, but I'm being told it's 18 months. I'm creating all these parameters, these false parameters around an 18-month project. And I'm going to get at some point into that project and realize, wow, there's no way we're going to do this in 18 months. So therefore, I need to cut scope. I need to cut change management from the schedule. I can't worry about data migration now. I'm just going to have to, start over with new data, whatever. I'm just giving some examples here. But those sorts of decisions end up being bad decisions that you end up having to make because you had unrealistic expectations. So that's why it's so important to make sure you have those expectations aligned and clear and realistic up front. And you also want to make sure that you understand the risk with time, cost, and resources. And as I mentioned, you want to make sure you have some professional skepticism with your vendor. The point of this thought here is that your implementation process and the time and resources and money you invest in your implementation should far exceed the time and money you invest in the software evaluation and selection. A lot of times organizations get caught up in sort of an analysis paralysis cycle. They on one hand, you want to give them kudos because they're being very thorough in their evaluation and they're making sure that they find the right software, which is great. But on the other hand, no technology is perfect. And the more you analyze any product that's out there, any system or any technology that you might want to deploy, you're going to find problems with it, things that don't match exactly what you need. And that's okay. You want to know what those are, but you also don't want to get so hung up that you can't make a decision because you can't find that unicorn or that rainbow of perfect software that doesn't exist. So it's one way to look at this is you don't want to rush the selection process. You want to be thorough. You want to make sure you find the right technology, but at some point you get a point of diminishing returns. You're overthinking it. You're spending too much time and money on the selection. And the way you have to look at this is resources are limited. Every time or every hour of time and every dollar of budget you spend on the selection process is one less hour and one less dollar you can spend on the implementation. So the faster you can get to a good decision means that you can spend more time and money on the implementation, which is where the real challenge and where the real potential success comes from. So you want to make sure you've got that selection done in an objective, effective, fast way. And that's just as an example of a way we help our clients do that is we have a database that has 30,000 business requirements against close to 1,000 different systems in the marketplace. And so we can go and pull up any of those requirements to see which systems best handle those requirements. And it's a good objective way to provide objective data that sort of counterbalances the bias data you're going to get from your vendors and the demos and the RFP process. But it also speeds things up too. It's going to help us get to that short list and help us get to a decision faster because we have that tool set supporting us. So that's just one example of how you can be effective, speed things up, and focus more on the implementation. And you really want to make sure of consulting firms or project teams that drag out the selection process, either because they don't know what they're doing and they don't know enough about the different systems in the market, or it could be that's, if it's a software selection firm, it maybe that's how they make their money. So they want to spend more time and money on it. So you just be leery of all that. You want to make sure that you've got a realistic and aggressive but effective selection process so that you can spend more time on the implementation. And then a sixth thing here is to know that there are no silver bullets. So you have to be aware of the industry hype and all the best practices and industry pre-configurations and the hype around the cloud and how easy it is to deploy cloud technologies. Just be aware that there's a lot of silver bullets out there. There's always going to be, there always has been. That's how vendors sell, right? They create hype and they perpetuate that hype by not only selling their software, but also hiring industry analysts to put out reports that are telling you the same thing, which is technology is great and these are the silver bullets. Some of the common things, some of the most common areas of hype right now in the industry are certainly cloud is one. And it's not to say that people shouldn't be moving to the cloud, but it's to say that if you're moving to the cloud, just know that it's not a silver bullet. It doesn't make your implementation easier. It's just not going to make it easier. You still have to change your processes. You still have to change your people. You still struggle with all the failure points or the risk points that I've already talked about. None of that stuff goes away as a result of cloud. So you just have to be aware the cloud is a silver bullet. Another example is Agile. A lot of times now, I think what the software vendors and system integrators are doing is they're sort of piggybacking on this lean startup trend, I guess you call it, and in Agile movements within the software development space. They're kind of piggybacking on those trends to address a perceived problem in the industry, which is implementations take too long and take too much money. So what they're doing is they're saying, well, let's call it an Agile approach. Then we'll be Agile in our implementations. Well, that's great. It sounds good, but just because you're going faster in the wrong direction doesn't mean that's the right answer. So you just want to be aware of, and again, back to that skepticism, make sure you understand what some of those challenges are. And I mentioned, anything that has to do with cookie cutter or fix all strategies, you want to be leery of whenever a vendor's telling you that this solves all your problems, because it's not going to solve them all. And the key takeaway here is that last bullet, which is that transformations are hard. So whether you're using an Agile approach or deploying cloud technologies or pre-configured industry solutions, okay, maybe there's some benefit to that stuff, but at the end of the day, this is hard work. You've got to roll up your sleeves, change your processes, change your people, figure out how your systems and data are going to tie together. There's a lot of risk associated with a project like this. So none of that stuff goes away. You still have to do all that. So that's the risk of silver bullets, is it creates this false expectation that things are going to be easier than they really are. And then the seventh thing is to control the tempo of the project. And I mentioned this earlier, that it's your project. You don't want to be rushed prematurely into implementation just because you're getting a once in a lifetime deal on software licenses or software subscriptions, which, by the way, those once in a lifetime deals typically are honored at any point you're ready to buy software. So don't fall for that. But there's a lot of reasons why organizations rush, and it's important to remember that it's always better. It's cheaper and faster to implement right the first time. It's a lot more expensive when you have to redo it or have 2 or 3 tries at this. You might as well spend less time and money on the overall project by doing it right the first time. And again, you can look at a budget on paper and see that it shows a number, but oftentimes that number is not realistic. It's actually going to balloon to, say, double that. So then that begs the question of, okay, instead of doubling an unrealistic number, what if we take that unrealistic number and make it realistic? Maybe we add 20% or whatever the number is to the time and budget, but that ensures that we have more likelihood of success. So you want to get it right the first time, and you also want to, address conflicting priorities and understand that if you are going through a massive amount of change as an organization, and a software vendor is coming in telling you they can implement in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months or some unrealistic number, you have to understand that, well, maybe we push back and say, well, let's not make it a 12-month project. Let's make it a 24-month project to account for the fact that we have competing priorities. We're going through a lot of changes as an organization, and maybe we're risk adverse. We just move slowly as an organization. That it's not the time, it's not the time to decide you're going to be a fast-moving, aggressive organization if you're not. Doing a big implementation or transformation is not the time to make that decision and then assume that you're just going to be more aggressive or change your culture overnight, because you're not going to. And you're also not going to change those competing priorities unless you have clear commitment from your leadership team to stop other initiatives that are conflicting with that. So you just want to be realistic about the landscape, the culture, who you are, and let that drive the tempo of your project, not the software vendors or system integrators. So all this is all transformation. It all takes time. And then finally, last but not least, in fact, I'd say most importantly, change management. The organizations that fail, and when I say fail, I'm referring to projects that clients have helped us or hired us to come recover because they failed with themselves or with another consulting firm, or in cases where an attorney hires us, like Marcus Harris, who you'll hear from later today. An attorney like Marcus hires us to be an expert witness in a failed lawsuit or a failed project that has led to lawsuit. What we find in all those cases, every single instance, is that change management wasn't addressed properly. There was a lack of focus on change management, but yet this people component is the most important. So it is very safe to say, and I'm very skeptical of any sort of universal one size fits all sorts of solutions or answers, with the exception of the fact of that second bullet, which is that your project will fail without change management. And I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a high growth startup type of company or if you're a mature multi-billion-dollar global organization. No matter who you are, the project is going to fail if you don't address change management well. Every organization is full of people that are imperfect. Every organization has a culture that is going to be disrupted by this project. Every organization has its own business processes and systems that are going to be disrupted by this project. All that means that you need change management. If without it, you're going to fail. And that typically goes well beyond training and communications. That includes things that I've included examples of here: organizational design, defining what job roles and responsibilities are going to look like going forward, business readiness, the change impact, understanding how different departments and individuals are affected by the changes, and then ultimately helping them through those changes, benefits realization, the communications, the executive alignment. Those are all examples, just a few examples of areas where change management can help enable some of these process improvements or help enable a more effective transformation. And one of the another thing, if you're interested in more about change management, in addition to listening to Teresa Richardson's presentation from yesterday about change management, I also encourage you to download our change management guide, which you can find on our website. If you just go to thirdstage-consulting.com, go to the resource center, you'll find a guide to change management that you can download that has it elaborates a lot more on a lot of the stuff on this slide here. So those are a few of the things that, 8 things that are critical to any transformation. And it's really the ways to avoid failure and address some of the risks that we talked about.